It's a great honour and great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Earl and the Countess for the invitation, and to my fellow speakers for warming us all up this morning and getting the debate going. I want to look at two things which I think are intertwined. How England or Britain lost the American War and what that loss looked like. And secondly, the impact it had on the development of historical scholarship as a means of understanding, comprehending, and responding to the events of the war. As you know, the American War comes in the aftermath of the triumphal 7 Years' War, where Britain had reached the apogee of its imperial glory. It had conquered large chunks of India, it had expanded and taken Canada away from France, it had been generally successful, and at the backbone of all of those developments, the idea that this war had been lost was a devastating shock to a country which had become quite used to winning and had rather assumed it had taken over the mantle of great power from its rivals. And of course, for many in Britain, that was associating yourself with the ancient past. Was Britain the new Roman Empire? And that's certainly how it looks in 1763. It doesn't look like that in 1782. So what goes wrong? Why doesn't the Royal Navy do the things that it did in the previous wars? And why are so many countries up in arms, quite literally, and thinking about waging war on Britain? Having reached the apogee, is everybody trying to pull Britain back down again? The defeat in the war and the defeat in major battles, notably at Saratoga, the Chesapeake Capes and Yorktown, prompts a great deal of reflection in Britain. There's a lot of cultural responses, which include Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Remember, Gibbon isn't an academic historian in an ivory tower. He's an MP and a junior member of the government throughout this period. So he is writing about the decline and fall of one empire while he's living through the decline and fall of another. The allegory, I think, is very close, and it's intentional. 18th century authors did not hide the fact that they are writing about the past as an allegory. Most in the 20th century don't do that. But I don't want to talk about Edward Gibbon. I want to talk about somebody who you may not have heard of. An unknown Scottish army officer named Robert Beatson, whose dates are 1742 to 1818, who wrote the first serious analytical history of British naval activity. It's called Naval and Military Memoirs of Great Britain from the year 1727 to the present time. And what he did was take something which was normally written up as a record, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and analyze it to turn it into something which would generate lessons that could be taken to heart by statesmen, senior officers, and junior commanders. And despite being a soldier himself and putting military in his title, he only mentioned the army when it was engaged in combined operations with the Navy. So going back to a theme that both Andrew and Jeremy explained before lunch, this is very much about how you project power from the sea to the shore and how you interact those two forces, something at which Britain was very much involved in the 7 Years' War. But Beatson isn't just a soldier. He's the next door neighbour of Adam Smith, and they are on very close terms. He has access to Smith's library. His neighbours in Kirkcaldy, who include two outstanding Royal Navy officers of this period, Captain Philip Patton, who was his brother-in-law, and also Charles Middleton, who would go on as Lord Barham to be in charge of the Navy in the Trafalgar campaign. These are all men impacted by the Scots Enlightenment, that explosion of knowledge that turned Edinburgh into a centre of intellectual activity at a time when the English universities were a little on the moribund side. The Scottish universities were pushing ahead. And the smart money for educating your heir was to send them to Edinburgh to learn and then send them to either Oxford or Cambridge to acquire a little bit of culture of a more rumbustious sort. His target audience, Beatson that is professional political elites charged with learning lessons. He published 6 volumes which covered the period between 1740 and 1763, and then 3 more volumes which dealt with the American War. These were not instant books. They came out 15, 20 years after the event. So his account of the American War is not fully published until 1804, by which time the Napoleonic Wars have started. So this isn't a quick dash to the print room. The connection between the Enlightenment and naval history has attracted remarkably little attention in Scotland, where Beatson is completely ignored, because naval history is an English subject, and therefore Scottish writers on naval history are ignored. He's taken very seriously as a British historian, but not as a Scottish historian. He's not mentioned in any of the standard works on the Scots Enlightenment, but he certainly does feature in many of them. Britain does not lose its wars on land. So the idea that Britain lost the American War on land is one that needs to be investigated. Britain has very rarely been engaged as a principal in major continental wars, because the British Isles are relatively small, its resources are relatively limited, and its interests are not those of a continental power. So we often look at specific periods. First World War is a particularly bad example, when Britain did become a continental power at enormous cost, doing terrible damage to the state and its wider interests. Britain has lost its wars by losing command of the sea, and at that point it is incumbent on governments to either get out of the war or find some way of compromising. I would argue that the American War was lost on the 27th of July 1778 during an inconclusive naval battle in the English Channel. It was lost because of partisan politics, because of a delayed and slow mobilization, which, as you heard this morning, was not the fault of Lord Sandwich, who had very much urged early mobilization. It may have been a response to the cost of the Spanish armament in 1770 and the impact that had on budgeting, a wish not to spend that money all over again. So if you look at the Chesapeake Capes as a decisive battle, it's not a decisive battle. The numbers aren't big enough. Cornwallis's force isn't big enough to be decisive. That defeat is not the cause of the end of the war, as Jeremy, I think, stressed. It's very much about losing impetus and enthusiasm and the defeat of the government. So what happens in the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes? The French have fitted out their fleet, which is based in Brest at the end of the Brittany Peninsula, as a precaution, as they're thinking of joining the war. The British have just mobilized their fleet as well. But neither fleet has been out on a cruise of exercise. The ships haven't had shakedown opportunities. They haven't done enough sea training. So they're not going to be in tip-top order. The French Admiral d'Orvilliers has been given orders he is not to engage in close battle with the English. The French learned in previous wars that if you get too close to the English fleet, you will be defeated and most of your ships will be captured. So he is very focused on not getting into a close battle. The English fleet is commanded by Augustus Keppel, who was a star captain in the previous war, one of the heroes of the Battle of Quiberon Bay. He was an opposition MP. His third in command, Hugh Palliser, was a government MP and a member of the Admiralty Board. And you can start to see the problems that are going to come up here. If they win the battle, it will be fine. If they lose the battle, there will be endless recriminations. And that essentially is what happens. D'Orvilliers and Keppel engage on crossing tracks. So they're firing broadsides at each other while proceeding in precisely the opposite direction. So it's a crossing engagement on opposite tracks. The English are firing into the hulls of the French ships, where they cause more casualties than the French do. The French are firing into the rigging of the English ship to disable them and prevent them from being able to continue the battle. And these are fleets of roughly 30 ships of the line each. By the time they've finished this maneuver, both sides have damage. The English are damaged mostly in the rigging, and it will take some time to repair the rigging and get the ships fully seaworthy again. In this period, the British flagship, it is HMS Victory's first ever battle, and it's not a success. is so badly damaged it takes quite a long time to change course. And the third in command, Hugh Palliser's ships, are very badly damaged and are lying in a huddle trying to get their rigging repaired. Keppel signals to Palliser to form the line and rejoin the action. Palliser doesn't even acknowledge the signal, possibly because he can't see it, possibly because he doesn't want to see it. D'Orvilliers then uses that opportunity to keep away at a distance. His rigging is in better condition. He's able to leave the battlefield without the British being able to chase him. So it's essentially a drawn battle, but the critical thing is the British had to win this battle because it had two effects. One, it meant that France would be able to detach its other main fleet, its Mediterranean fleet, into the American theatre, and that's the fleet that is serving in the Caribbean and later at the Chesapeake Capes. And two, it encourages France's ally Spain, which has not yet joined the war, to join the war. In 1779 and 1780, very large Franco-Spanish fleets operating out of Brest threatened to stage an invasion of Britain, pinning down large amounts of military and naval resource on the defensive in the English Channel. These campaigns are entirely negative for the British. They can't use those forces in any positive way. They are outnumbered. And because of the split between the government and the opposition, many senior officers refused to serve, including Keppel. Into the middle of all of this is tossed a very interesting hand grenade when it is reported in one of the opposition newspapers that Admiral Palliser had not done his duty and should be court-martialed. This is a serious offence. Not to do your utmost in the face of the enemy is the charge on which Admiral John Byng was court-martialed and for which he was shot. Palliser publicly asks Keppel to refute the allegation, and Keppel refuses. Palliser then accuses Keppel of dereliction of duty, so both men are put on trial at court-martials for their lives. Both are acquitted, rightly so, because neither of them was entirely negligent, but it exposes a serious problem within the Naval Officer Corps. It leads to many Whig officers not continuing to serve in this war against the Americans. They will serve against the French and the Spanish, but not the Americans. So you've got an armed force telling the government that they want to pick and choose their opponents. It's not really a viable strategy. So the Navy is, I think, seriously weakened by this. And it has an impact which takes quite a long time to unravel. The French and the Spanish now have the initiative, and this is very unusual. Normally, in the Great Sea Wars from the 18th and early 19th century, it is the British who have the initiative, and they're able to impose themselves because they don't have this big continental commitment which they face in America. Britain is defending a position that's trying to recover in America. It's also having to put a lot of manpower into defending the United Kingdom. This is the beginning of a fight back. This is HMS Foudroyant, which itself was a French prize, capturing the French ship Pegasi and leading it into Portsmouth Harbour. This is painted by Dominic Serres, who, like many of Britain's best marine artists, was not British. He was in fact a French sailor who'd been taken as a prisoner of war in the 7 Years' War. The captain of the Foudroyant is a man called John Jarvis, best known as Earl St. Vincent, who won the Battle of Cape St. Vincent and the man who led Nelson into battle and gave him quite a lot of his tools for his trade. What the Royal Navy slowly but surely does is to work through its officer cadre and find the leaders who are going to lead the Navy into the next war, both the admirals and the captains. And many of those men are going to earn their rank and their distinction in this war by doing better in the later battles. Among them is Earl Cornwallis's younger brother, William, who was a great personal friend of Horatio Nelson, and both of them served in the Caribbean in this conflict. So in the previous war, 1759, Battle of Quiberon Bay, the French Navy had been broken in battle. It was pursued into Quiberon Bay and effectively annihilated by a very aggressive fleet led by Admiral Lord Hawke. The two-star captains on that day were Augustus Keppel and William Lord Howe. After the American War, Keppel would very shortly die and had no role. Howe would have a major role in rebuilding the Royal Navy. So here are the men who helped Beatson write his book: Charles Middleton on this side, Richard Kempenfelt on the other side. These two officers are leading the reform of the Navy's methods of control. Ultimately, the lesson of the Battle of Cape Ushant is that the signaling system is inadequate to convey complex instructions in the middle of a firefight. These men are reforming every part of the Navy, but they are reforming in particular the signaling system to make it quicker, more easily understood, and more capable of expressing the opinion and the ideas of the Commander-in-Chief. And the first man to use this new signaling system effectively is Richard Kempenfelt, who took the victory to its first major victory in another action off Cape Ushant, where he intercepted a French troop convoy in 1781 and outmaneuvered the French escort forces and captured storeships and troop ships, which helped to weaken the French army in the North American theatre. Had Britain established command of the sea in 1778, there would have been no French soldiers in North America. There would have been no French fleet in the Caribbean. The French would have been pinned in their bases as they had been in the previous war and would be in the subsequent war. Nor, of course, would Spain have joined the conflict. So we're looking at a battle which had the possibility of isolating the war in North America from the European theatre, keeping not just the French and the Spanish out, but also the Dutch, who become involved, and blocking the interests of Russia in cutting Britain's ability to impose blockades. So here is Naval and Military Memoirs of Great Britain, Robert Beatson. It's printed in London and it's published by one of the top London publishers, who also published Adam Smith, as it happens. So this is a very large analytical text which is designed to use the latest ideas in Enlightenment history to advance the arguments about understanding the past through serious study. And it comes in 6 volumes. What the British had to do in the war at sea was to recover the initiative. They had to find some way in which they could deal with the threats they faced across a series of theatres. The initiative had passed to France. Spain had joined France, and together in 79, 80 and 81, very large Franco-Spanish fleets cruise in the Channel. They can't assemble enough troops quickly enough to stage an invasion. The English fleet in the Channel is not big enough to engage them. And it spends the entire summer moving around to try and thwart an attack on Portsmouth or Plymouth, which was the two that were most concerned to the British government, and introducing new technologies. We heard earlier about that. Critical to the new technologies is copper sheathing for the hulls of ships. Wooden ships, as they sail through the salt water, accumulate large amounts of marine growths, both seaweed and mollusks. So by the end of a year's commission, you will have lost maybe 10%, 15% of your speed through the water, because the underwater body of the ship is not smooth, it is now rough and covered in obstacles. These marine growths can be prevented by putting thin sheets of copper on the underwater body of the ship. The marine growths do not grow on this. Having your ships coppered gives you a speed advantage over the enemy. And in most previous wars, the French ships were sailing faster than English ships, because, as the French pointed out, they actually did some geometry to work out better lines. The English built ships to float and fight, the French built them to go fast. Coppered English ships were faster than uncoppered French ships. So all of a sudden, the English have a tactical advantage, which they will maximize in later actions. So coppering becomes the new thing. And before anybody thinks it's a great new thing and it solved the problem, it also caused a huge problem, which manifested itself in 1782. You're all familiar with the principle of a battery. galvanic action between two different metals. So wooden warships are held together with very long iron bolts. And the combination of iron bolts and copper sheathing is galvanic action which eats through the iron bolts. By 1782, English warships are starting to fall to pieces. And in the aftermath of the Battle of the Saints, several ships are lost on the voyage home. At least one of them we know from details literally fell to pieces after the battering it received and this problem. One of the ships that fought at the Chesapeake Capes also had to be abandoned because galvanic action had destroyed its integrity. So this was a short-term fix which had to be worked out. They eventually decided that if you put a tarred paper between the copper and the iron bolt, everything was fine. So they were using this technology before it was fully matured. So big risk, big benefits, but also big prices. Post-war, the Navy had to be completely overhauled and all of the iron bolts removed and replaced with what were called mixed metal bolts, alloy bolts, which would not corrode in galvanic action. The second was a new kind of cannon, which is called a carronade. It's a short, stumpy gun of large caliber, which favored the English who fought at close quarters rather than the French who fought at long quarters. So a cannon that's mounted on a warship will get you out to about 1,500 yards if you fire it accurately. But most fighting is much, much closer. So making the gun shorter and lighter means you can fire more rounds of larger caliber ammunition at short range. And the English have these guns on board, the French and Spanish do not. So they have a firepower advantage and a speed advantage. And what is the pivot point of Britain's major war in this period? It is the relief of Gibraltar in 1780, 1781, and 1782. It is not trying to establish control of North American waters. Gibraltar, the fortress at the entrance to the Mediterranean, is absolutely existential to Britain's global power role, because Britain is a great power in the European system because it dominates the Mediterranean and has influence over all the Mediterranean powers. Over 100 years ago, Sir Julian Corbett wrote a brilliant book called England in the Mediterranean, where he demonstrated how the emergence of England as a Mediterranean power changed the European balance and made it a great power. So the great events of 1700 are that the English control the Mediterranean and the Russians are marching westward. Two new great powers have joined the system. Naval power in the Mediterranean makes you a great power. Means that when you talk to the Pope, he listens, even though you're not a Catholic. It makes regional powers pay attention to English desires, including the Barbary Corsairs. So every year, a fleet has to be assembled, a big fleet, full-size battle fleet, to escort a very large number of transport ships carrying food, supplies, and replacement garrison down to Gibraltar, and they have to fight their way into Gibraltar. So this is the biggest sustained commitment of naval power in this war. They're also trying to keep Minorca, which they'd taken in the 7 Years' War. That fortress and harbour falls. They lose Minorca, but they keep Gibraltar. The first relief is conducted by Admiral Lord Rodney, who you saw a little earlier, and along the way he meets the Spanish fleet, which is carrying supplies for its own purposes, and he captures most of their fleet and takes the fleet and the Spanish transports along with the English transports to Gibraltar, which keeps Gibraltar going for a whole year. Rodney then sails to the West Indies, where he takes command and conducts a series of campaigns defending the British islands in that area. The second relief in 1781 is relatively straightforward. There is no serious opposition. In 1782, this is the big and last test of power in the war between the Bourbon states and Britain. For Spain, this is why they're in the war. They've picked up some of their former American colonies during the war in the West Indies. They've gone nowhere near the American rebels because they don't want to encourage that kind of behavior. They have a large empire. For them, they're in the war to get Gibraltar. And if they're not going to get Gibraltar, they're out of the war. By this stage, the new signal system has been developed by William Howe, who has come back into command after abandoning his role earlier in the war alongside his brother. And he takes command of the Grand Fleet in the spring of 1782. He takes it to sea, he drills his forces, he introduces a new and much more efficient signal book. And he uses this to sweep aside the Allied fleet that is trying to blockade Gibraltar. But before that, he has also secured Britain's ocean communications. He has made sure that Britain can continue collaborating effectively across the oceans with India. Why is India important? Money and something else. What are the two most important components of gunpowder? Sulfur and saltpeter. The best saltpeter in the world comes from India. And the East India Company's founding charter said that it was to supply the English government with saltpeter. That was one of the stipulations. And the best sulfur comes from Sicily, and so commanding the Mediterranean really is important. British gunpowder was better. So you've got new guns, new copper ships, you've got better gunpowder, and a new tactical system. And this culminates in September 1782 with the last of the three reliefs of Gibraltar. At this point, the Spanish give up. The French and Spanish fleets haven't stopped the British relieving Gibraltar. They're not going to get this anytime soon. Gibraltar, with a new garrison and fully stocked, will last another year. They don't have a year's money, so they give up. So the war beyond America resolves itself at this point. Here is Lord Howe. John Singleton Copley, American artist, painted 1794. He's reforming the system and imposing control because command of the sea is existentially important. And as First Sea Lord, and then First Lord of the Admiralty in the 1780s, Howe has several opportunities to take squadrons to sea. He's constantly reframing this signal book, which he's been working on. And he makes the signal book far less complicated. It isn't now trying to tell you numbers, it's trying to tell you what to do. So the signal, instead of showing you it was number 3, now tells you, do this. You open the book, you see the flag, the order is complete. And Howe's object is to make naval battle decisive. Taking a ship or two from the enemy is not decisive. In fleets of 30, you need to destroy at least half the enemy's ships, capture or destroy. That's decisive. If you take 2 or 3, that's annoying, but it's not decisive. You've got to change the tactics so that you don't get these Battle of Cape Rochant actions where the enemy just gets away and goes on to do what they want to do. So Howe's objective is to have a great fleet in the channel approaches that can stop the French coming out and challenging British security and threatening to mount an invasion. 1794 is a campaign that involves the Americans as well. The French Republic is desperately short of food, and it organizes a very large grain convoy from the United States to relieve some of this distress. And the Jacobin government is so determined to get this grain convoy that they order out the entire fleet, and that's France's main battle fleet, way out into the Atlantic to intercept and escort this grain convoy home. The British are aware of this and set out to use that grain convoy as the bait to draw the French fleet into a decisive battle. Lord Howe is now in command. He's no longer at the Admiralty, he is just the Admiral of the fleet. His opponent is going to be Louis Thomas Villaret de Joyeuse, who before the Revolution was a quite junior lieutenant. And with the Revolution, all the senior officers have gone, either chopped off or exiled themselves, and he is the senior man standing in the Navy. That's quite a task for a relatively young officer to take on. He's actually going to make a pretty good fist of it, but he's not going to win. So it's now about out at sea, finding convoy, finding enemy, setting up battle, winning battle. Howe never finds the convoy. One of his ships did, but it never got back to give him the information. He does find the French fleet. There is then a very long and complicated period of movement in which there are a series of actions leading up to a battle on the 1st of June, where Howe is finally able to do what he wants to do, which is to attack the enemy and use the new tactics that his signalling system are set up to achieve. So 25 ships on the British side, 26 on the French, very evenly matched. British casualties, 1,200 killed and wounded. This is a very heavy battle. It's unusual for a Royal Navy to suffer casualties of that rate, far more than at Trafalgar. 6 ships captured from the French, 1 sunk, 4,000 killed and wounded, 3,000 captured. It's quite clear who wins this battle. It is 400 nautical miles off the coast of France. On the day, the plan for Howe is for his fleet to break through the enemy's line at every point. So they have the wind behind them. They will break through the French line. They will then engage from the leeward side and keep the enemy in battle until they're captured. They will deny them the ability to flee the battlefield. They can't just put their helms over and sail away. There's a British ship blocking them out. Ideally, each British ship should have broken through the French line in the right place and set up this absolutely decisive battle. In reality, nothing goes according to plan. The captain of HMS Caesar doesn't understand the instruction. He seems to have been semi-illiterate, and he just carries on sailing because what else would you do? Howe in the Queen Charlotte, flagship named after George III's wife, does lead through. He puts his ship under the stern of Villaret Joyeuse's flagship, the Montagne, named after the French radical political party, and engages at point-blank range. Several other British ships break through too, and this leads to serious close-quarters fighting in which one French ship, the Vengeur du Peuple, is sunk by gunfire, which is almost unheard of in naval battles of this period. Massive casualties. The Montagne is able to escape because she shoots away the Queen Charlotte's fore topmast, which is a critical part of the rigging, denying Howe the ability to capture the enemy. Here's a rather tidy version of what was happening on the upper deck. None of the men on the upper deck were dressed like this. Even the Admiral would have been dressed in the clothes of a common sailor. He might have worn his hat, but anything else would have been utterly superfluous at these close ranges. And they would all have been begrimed with gunpowder smoke. They would come out of this looking like chimney sweeps. This is a really spectacular performance. It does exactly what the Battle of Cape Ushant had not done 20 years earlier. It gave the British command of the sea. To the extent that in the whole of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the French main fleet at Brest never came out of harbour again to seek battle with the British. 6 ships taken, 1 destroyed. The French got their grain convoy home, and they considered that a great triumph until you look at the amount of grain they managed to bring home. It wasn't enough to feed the people of Brittany. None of that grain would have reached Paris, which is where the bread riots were. So it was almost certainly a wasted effort. So what Howe has done is given the Royal Navy the tools to win. He's given them a demonstration of how to win. He's given some of the younger captains battle practice, so they've actually been in a first-class fleet action. And this is going to transform the way the Navy operates going forward. It also leads to the creation of a new art of war. This is the art of the apocalyptic sublime. This is led by the Alsatian artist Philip-Jacques de Loutherbourg, who was a great scenery painter in the West End stage. Some of John Burgoyne's performances may well have had scenery by de Loutherbourg. His ability to paint enormous scale work at pace was unprecedented. This is his version of the Glorious 1st of June, And the critical thing is here, this is the Queen Charlotte, and this is where the foretopmast has just been shot away. The Union is still flying, but the foretopmast, it has come down. So he's got a great eye for the dramatic moment, for the most extreme of events. And all of those men struggling in the water, there was nothing like this in the battle. This is a reference to Noah's flood. And it's saying quite candidly, this is one of the most important things that happens in the history of the world since Noah's flood. The apocalyptic sublime is all about things of tremendous power which change the way the world operates. J.M.W. Turner's great painting Trafalgar was created to be the pair to this picture, and they hung in the audience chamber of George IV at St. James's Palace in the 1820s. And Turner paid homage to Lutherberg, who he had known and worked with earlier in his career, by including in his picture of Trafalgar the Victory losing her foretopmast. This is inaccurate, and he knew it. It's a reference. He's saying these two things are the same, even down to a piece of imagined battle damage. So two pictures, the de Lutherberg existed, the Turner was created, and they should be hung side by side. And it would be nice if they could be placed so today. HMS Defence dismasted at the glorious Battle of June. Right in the middle of our picture, we've got two French ships and one British ship, which has no masts on at all, completely wrecked, but still victorious and defeating the enemy. Nicholas Pocock, by contrast, is a Bristol seafarer who became an artist of the sea, following many commissions. He's the leading realist artist of the sea of this war, where de Lutherberg and Turner are the much more imaginative images. So this is an earlier stage in the combat of the Defence, caught between two ships. The captain of the Defence, James Gambier, was a man of great faith, and his companions in arms wondered if he'd sworn at the height of the battle. He said he hadn't. The French rewrote the glorious 1st of June as a triumph. Republican radical regimes are quite good at this, as American audiences will know. The idea that the sinking crew of the Vengeur, which sank due to battle damage, several images of that, as they went down, was singing the Marseillaise and cheering for the Republic. The English officers who were close to the scene said, no, they did what most men do under the circumstance, which is to call out for their mothers. So it's a battle which has enormous political significance. When Howe returns to Portsmouth, he is awarded a sword with a diamond-encrusted hilt by his relative, the king. The Howes are quite well connected. And it sets the seal on what is going to be a much more straightforward war for the British. They go to the continent in 1794, they come back from the continent in 1795, and they don't join the Western European War until 1814. They do not get sucked into a continental war they can't win. They end up defending Lisbon, keeping the French from occupying that critical naval base. The Battle of the Prairial in the year 2 is the way the French remember the battle, and there is Vengeur sinking. This is their equivalent of Nelson's column, but of course Nelson's column is about winning. Losing is not quite the same. So 1788 pays dividends, learning from the lessons. And those two men that I mentioned, Philip Patton and Charles Middleton, they are in naval administration. Patton is a battleship commander in the war, and Middleton is an administrator. They have changed the Navy, and they have worked through Robert Beatson. They have made sure that he has all the information he needs to energize those transformations that the Navy is going to undertake to become a much more influential force in future. So when Nelson goes into the Mediterranean to command the fleet that will fight the Battle of the Nile, he has Lord Howe's signalling system. He has a group of officers, most of whom have commanded at the ships at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. And he doesn't have to rely on signals to tell people what to do, because at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, he ignored the signals and used his initiative to stunning effect. And the men he commanded at the Battle of the Nile had been there. They had seen this, and they had seen how he had been rewarded for using his skill and initiative. So he used Howe's signals to set the fleet up for the attack into Aboukir Bay. The glorious first. So, going into Aboukir Bay, the French fleet is at anchor. They're not going nowhere. Nelson has one less ship than the French, and he works out immediately that he can sail his ships inside the French line and outside. So he's leading the fleet into battle. Once he realizes the position the French are in, he backs sail and drops into the middle of his fleet. He orders the attack to go round the inboard side of the French fleet. They're at anchor, they can't move. They can fight, but they can't sail. He then leads the attack on the outside of the French line, so they're doubling up. They're firing from both sides, and that speeds up the process by at least 50%, possibly 75%. He's indoctrinated his people into the way he thinks. Highly aggressive, absolute destruction, complete victory. 11 of 13 French battleships were taken in that night. 2 got away because the English crews were too tired to fight anymore by 2 o'clock in the morning. They'd fought continuously for 8 hours. Nelson himself had been hit on the head with a piece of shrapnel and had a hairline fracture of the skull and concussion, but he was still there when the enemy flagship blew up and absolute victory was clear. After the battle, Lord Howe wrote to him and congratulated him on this stunning achievement, and Nelson very humbly wrote back and said, "But your lordship's instructions made it possible." So the Navy, which had been split down the middle, violent political partisan arguments, serious court-martials, failure, being on the defensive against the French and Spanish, which was humiliating, within 2 decades was right back at the absolute top of its game again. It had used the past, seriously and intelligently processed, to develop new ideas. And naval history has had that function ever since. We are still talking to contemporary navies about what we can learn from the past. It's an endless process. So connecting history and the conduct of war has been a critical element. It's not accidental that I don't teach in a history department. I teach in a war studies department, and that large numbers of my students are indeed professional practitioners. So thinking about the past is something that we always have to do. And every version of the past changes as we move away from those events, as the questions we ask of them become different. So which conflicts do we need to look at today to think about the next conflict? Well, we can all have an opinion on that. So here is the attack at the Nile. Nelson is in vanguard. These ships all sail inside the French line, and Nelson leads that attack, so they're now doubling up on the enemy ships, and that means they have no chance of winning. The French can't sail because the wind is blowing from the north dead onto their bows. They can't go anywhere. If they unmoor, they will almost certainly wreck. So they have no mobility whatsoever. The French flagship, L'Orient, is a very big ship, and it's going to explode. You're all familiar with the lines, the boy stood on the burning deck. That's the burning deck, and the ship blew up. He was the captain's son, one of many casualties that day. The 2 ships had escaped. Nelson made sure he captured those as well before he went home. So it was a complete wipeout. And that situation in 1778 would have transformed the American war. There would have been no Spanish intervention. There would have been no French intervention in the New World. France would almost certainly have backed out of conflict. There would have been no problem with the Dutch, who were smuggling arms into the rebel camp. There would have been no problems with the Russians, who were trying to set up a league of neutrals to try and block Britain using the sea for strategic economic warfare against the rebels as well. So not having command of the sea, I would argue, is the critical problem in the American war. It stems from late mobilization, and as Andrew pointed out this morning, Lord Sandwich was very anxious to mobilize early, but I suspect the cost of the mobilization in 1770 deterred the government from doing this. That meant that the fleet was not fully up to speed when it went into battle. The French had clear orders not to fight that battle, and that left the Royal Navy pinned down on home defense mission for most of the war. It's not until the second relief of Gibraltar that you're able to get enough ships together to seriously think about winning. The battles in the Caribbean are inconclusive until 1782, when a combination of George Rodney and Samuel Hood win the Battle of the Saints Passage, exploiting a flaw in the wind and a more aggressive doctrine. The French are getting ready to invade Jamaica. The British are just looking for a fight, and they win that battle. And that battle will inspire what goes on going forward with officers like Nelson. He wasn't there, but William Cornwallis, who was, briefed him on what had happened. So to answer the big question, could Britain have won the American war? Well, it could certainly have limited it. It would have been more of a straightforward contest between Britain and the colonists. Whether that would have improved the odds ultimately is a different question. But after the Battle of the Saints, certainly the balance of power at sea and the balance of resilience is certainly in Britain's favour. Britain can still raise money, France cannot. Spain has no money. When the war ends, interestingly, a major naval arms race cuts in. The Spanish and the French build more and bigger ships so they can fight next time. But by the end of the Battle of Trafalgar, pretty much all of them have been sunk, captured, or destroyed. Just a question of how long it takes. So not having the full-strength Navy under the command of a trusted officer who was believed in by the administration at the Battle of Cape Vashon really did enormous damage to Britain's ability to win that war. And what happened afterwards with those reforms and then the development of the next generation of naval command emphasizes what was possible. It was possible to defeat the enemy decisively early in the war, and that was a missed opportunity. Thank you very much.
Right.